Hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ranji Khanna, and I'm the director of the Franklin Humanities Institute, where you find yourselves this evening. And I'm delighted to welcome you here today to mark how the time is out of joint, to welcome you to last year's Bookwatch event that was postponed due to weather. And we have some interesting weather tonight as well. Bookwatch has, since 2004, been one of FHI's signature events in which we collaborate with the library to celebrate the publication of a book from the previous year and invite our colleagues, both local and distant, to come and engage with it. Previous Bookwatch events have been organized around books by, from the most recent down, Richard Broadhead, Timothy Tyson, Michel Longino, Negar Motahede, Andrew Janiak, with Liz Milovich, Laurent Dubois, Roberta Donato, Srinivasa Ravmadan, Kate Hales, William Reddy, Carla Holloway, Michael Hart with Antonio Negri, the Volia Glimpf, J. Cameron Carter, Margaret Humphreys, Margaret Greer, Walter Mignolo, Maureen Quilligan, Torrell Moy, Anne Allison, Barbara Hernstein-Smith, and Kathy Davidson. Before I introduce David Morgan, let me briefly say something about the format of the event. Respondents, who will shortly be introduced by Deborah Jacobs, will each respond to David's book for approximately 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will give David the chance to respond to what they have to say. We'll open up to questions for David and the panelists from you, and we'll then have the chance to raise a glass to David at a reception, for which I hope you'll join us. And the Regulator bookstore will have copies of the books here, and David would be happy to sign copies. After all, one writes a book for a reason. And now to the business of the evening. David Morgan is Professor of Religious Studies with a secondary appointment in the Department of Art, Art History and Visual Studies at Duke. He has published several books and dozens of essays on the history of religious visual culture, on art history and critical theory, and on religion and media. And today we will be discussing Images at Work, the Material Culture of Enchantment, which was published in 2018 by OUP. Previous publications include The Forge of Vision, a visual history of modern Christianity, based on the 2012 Cadbury Lectures delivered at the University of Birmingham in the UK, and that appeared in 2015 from the University of California Press. The Embodied Eye, Religious Visual Culture and Social Life of Feeling from California, 2012. The Lure of Images, A History of Religion and Visual Media in America from Routledge, 2007. And 2 edited volumes that he edited and contributed to also, Religion and Material Culture, The Matter of Belief from Routledge, 2010, and Keywords in Religion, Media and Culture from Routledge, 2008. Earlier works of his include Visual Piety from University of California Press, 98, Protestants in Pictures, Oxford, 1999, and The Sacred Gaze, California, 2005. Morgan is co-founder and co-editor of the international scholarly journal Material Religion and co-editor of a book series at Routledge entitled Religion, Media and Culture. And he's currently at work on a new project, The Thing About Religion, an introduction to studying the materiality of belief. David's work has in many ways forged a platform for the discussion of visual culture and religion. In The Sacred Gaze from 2005, for example, he shows how visual culture in the context of religion is far more than the study of images. Rather, it includes, quote, rituals, epistemologies, tastes, sensibilities, and cognitive frameworks that inform visual experience, end quote. Being part of a religious community is for him seeing in a particular way. It is, quote, the particular configuration of ideas, attitudes, and customs that informs a religious act of seeing as it occurs within a given cultural and historical setting, quote. So, for example, the Hindu idea of darshan involves looking at the deity, or some may say the image of a deity, and being seen by it such that a relationship is created. Or in Tantric Buddhism, visibility manifests differently in, for example, the creation of the mandala and what he calls the condescension of the transcendent to human experience. there is a visual network that creates what he calls a social act of looking. In other works, he equally considers the visual culture of Protestants. In spite of the apparent irrelevance of visual culture to Protestantism, he has shown how serious accounts of contemporary religion fail because they ignore forms of Protestant visual piety. His sense of the visual expands more generally to material culture. So in The Lure of Images, A History of Religion and Visual Media in America, he looks at, quote, the history of the relationship between mass-produced visual media and religion in the United States. It's a journey from the 1780s to the present, from early evangelical tracts to teenage witches and televangelists, and from illustrated books to contemporary cinema. I'm greatly looking forward to our discussion today. Deborah will now introduce our panelists.
Jessica Boone is an Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Adjunct Associate Professor of History at UNC Chapel Hill. Her first book, The Mystical Science of the Soul, Medieval Cognition, and Bernardino de Laredo's Recollection Method, University of Toronto Press, 2012, combined the history of medicine and optics with the history of mysticism. She has published a number of articles on passion, spirituality, Mariology, and issues of gender in medieval and early modern religious texts. Her current book project, Spanish Passion, Jesus, Mary, and the Jews in the Castilian Religious Imagination, 1480 to 1540, integrates history of science and spirituality with history of emotions and the body. Elisa Jimenez is Assistant Professor in the Department of Classical Studies at Duke University. Her research engages with archaeological theory and Roman visual and material culture during the earliest phases of the expansion of the Roman Empire. Her 2008 book, Imágenes Híbridas, una aproximación postcolonialista al estudio de las necrópolis de la Bética, analyzes the impact of Roman colonization in the funerary rituals of southern Spain and how different discourses about collective ancestry were simultaneously mediated in the forum and the tomb. She co-directs the excavations at the Roman army camps near Numancia, one of the best preserved and oldest Roman camps in the Mediterranean and a key site to understand the role of the army in the creation of the first Roman provinces. Jennipher Coast is a scholar of religion who specializes in early Christian history and the religions of the ancient Mediterranean. Author of To Cast the First Stone, The Transmission of a Gospel Story, with Tommy Wasserman, Princeton 2018, Unprotected Texts, The Bible's Surprising Contradictions About Sex and Desire, Harper 1, 2011, and Abandoned to Lust, Sexual Slander and Ancient Christianity, Columbia, 2005. She studies early Christian texts, their contexts, and their receptions from multiple angles, with a particular focus on rhetoric and gendered discourse. Her numerous articles, book chapters, and edited books address the materiality of texts, the intersection of Christian practices with other ancient religions, and the ethics of interpretation in ancient as well as contemporary contexts. And last but not least, Tom Robicheaux, this is alphabetical order, is best known for his work on witchcraft in Europe. His most recent book, The Last Witch of Langenberg, explores the world of a village woman and the communities around her caught up in one of the last witch panics in Germany in the 17th century. His interest in microhistory, the genre of history writing that made this work possible, animates his leadership in Duke's new Micro-Worlds Lab. Teaching, exploring, and promoting microhistory in the Duke Micro-Worlds Lab informs a new book project about microhistorical methods, the craft of microhistory. In addition, he has begun the Series of Prevorst, sorry, too many consonants, a study of a sensational case of spirit mediumship, magic, and religious prophecy, and the Series' stunning impact on 19th century German medicine and nature philosophy. Exploring the surprising ways that magic, religion, and science are woven together in the modern world animates his popular undergraduate course, Magic, Science, and Religion. In addition, he is also known for introducing Duke undergraduates to firsthand historical research using the early printed books, manuscripts, and archival materials from the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome. In Images at Work, David Morgan provides a taxonomy of enchantment. For one, there is the enchantment of make-believe, which encompasses fiction, drawing the reader or viewer into an as-if scenario, in which play functions as a moral force, both through the joy of the game and through following rules, breaking rules, or coming to blows about rules. Yet there's also the enchantment of belief, variously the, quote, projecting onto inanimate objects qualities that humans possess, and or the, quote, ascription of agency to immaterial forces such as spirits, ancestors, or gods. Thus, enchantment of belief names the arena in which material objects have human qualities and immaterial forces act in human patterns. This results in beliefs that, quote, take shape in practices, beliefs considered literally true by their adherents, but which to outsiders appear superstitious, fetishistic, or indeed magical. This taxonomy undergirds the term proposed in Morgan's subtitle, the Material Culture of Enchantment. For the various forms of materiality at work in make-believe and belief not only help explain how enchantment works, that, quote, things enchant, but also how material culture often works, through, quote, enchantment that takes place in the extended social apparatus that envelops an object's social life, end quote. Morgan designates the social apparatus of objects with the Deleuzian term assemblage and the Latourian term network, and suggests that images through enchantment can work as focal objects, his term, or nodes in the network in such a way that they make the viewer, quote, the subject of seeing, and can potentially, quote, activate their moral agency. He even suggests, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, but perhaps pointedly, a substitution of the term enchantment network theory for Latour's actant network theory, a possibility that in my view serves to emphasize both the play across the assemblage and the ways that objects and humans co-constitute each other in enchantment and in general. And in doing so, Morgan has provided a rich palette of possibilities for reconsidering the study of material culture through the identification of enchantment and disenchantment across many types of objects and actants, across art, religion, and advertising, across centuries. While Morgan often delineates the two types of enchantment separately, he also probes them on a continuum, pointing out that, quote, people often make believe in order to believe. And it is this possibility that I would like to pursue today, as I think that this view of enchantment can help approach a problem in a particular case study that I've been wrestling with for a number of years. Even though David indicates that enchantment was the norm for the pre-modern, and that he's identifying it as continuing into the modern in order to undermine the rigorous division between fiction and belief proposed during the Enlightenment. As a medievalist, I find the ideas of making believe in order to believe and the material culture of enchantment to be useful tools to address certain issues in the always already enchanted pre-modern. Over the last decade, I've published studies and co-edited the translation of a portion of the visionary sermons of Juana de la Cruz, who lived from 1481 to 1534 and was for many years the abbess of a small Clarissan convent outside of Toledo in the early decades of Inquisition Spain. She is a remarkable, dare I say, unique figure in the history of Catholicism, as she gave multi-hour visionary orations every Sunday for 13 years. Orations that not only the nuns of her convent, but bishops, military commanders, and even Emperor Charles V considered to be sermons, an impossibility for a woman by any normal standard in Catholicism, whatever the century. The possibility for these performances was provided by the claim, believed by ecclesiastics and royalty alike, that Jesus took over Juana's body while she was in a trance state and spoke through her, describing what Juana was witnessing in heaven while she was raptured. In these sermons, Jesus re-narrated biblical episodes, adding a range of fantastical details, such as the passage describing how Eve fled in fear from Adam in the Garden of Eden due to the hideousness of his beard, and he had to pursue her amorously. Jesus also used these weekly sermons to describe the festivities that went on in heaven at every feast in the liturgical calendar. He and the angels and the saints would regularly dance dress up in fancy threads, dance and play games. Jesus was a bit of a cheat. Cuddle and kiss on marriage beds, regardless of gender, and feast on platters of magnificent food served on richly decorated table settings. Some of the food was served directly from Jesus' wounds. The nail holes in his hands produced delectable pastries, and his side wound top-shelf liquor, a rather more gluttonous than usual Eucharistic reference. In addition, at nearly every festivity, the angels would help Jesus perform what Juana refers to as figuras, which are not figures of speech, but rather allegorical pageants intended to teach the inhabitants of heaven, and surely the members of Juana's audience, about the consequences on earth and in hell for sin. It is self-evident that Juana's sermons overflow with embodiment and materiality and a multitude of gender dynamics, and scholars have applied these lenses. But I think that Morgan's new work can help push us on the true puzzle of these sermons, which is how in the world were they preached in the 1510s while the Inquisition was in full force? And how in the world were they, once collected in manuscript, read by several generations of male Franciscan readers who annotated the manuscript with approving comments? These sermons should not have been able to be preached, much less listened to, much less collated and preserved, and I think that the enchantment of material culture can help us think through why they were. In Sermon 14, for example, on Satan tempting Jesus in the desert, after narrating an elaborate version of the Bible story, Jesus describes how he requested that the angels on that Sunday lay out a garden split in two to represent heaven and hell. On the heaven side, the angels plant beautiful flowers and roses to create a bower. But on the other side, they put on a figura, an allegorical pageant of hell, which has a backdrop made up of painted cloths. On those cloths are depicted a riot of fires, beasts with horns, and demons with terrifying fingernails and teeth and fishspines and tails that tear sinners apart. The paintings show punishments inflicted by deformed dogs that eat heretics and infidels, or sinners thrust into bushes with thistles and spines that draw blood from those who had spent their life in the thicket of worldly delights. The imagery here cannot but evoke the rhetoric of Dante, and even more so the imagination of Bosch, yet it is presented not as a guided trip through the bowels of hell, but as a play put on by angels at Jesus' direction with a painted backdrop of hell in the midst of heaven. The flowers are real, planted by the angels in a celestial garden. The hellish torments are images intended to make clear the consequences of sin. But who is consuming these images? The angels don't need to be scared straight, nor the beatified. They have been sainted. Instead, the angels put on a show, create a fiction or a make-believe of hell in the one place hell cannot be. And the suspension of disbelief allows not the heavenly audience, but the earthly one to learn a lesson about sin. These images make not the viewers the subject of seeing, but the listeners, the audience of devotees who hear Jesus narrate what Juana sees, but what she sees is a pageant, a make-believe intended to alter moral actions. The heaven described through Juana in a trance is so fantastical as to make the distinction between orthodoxy and heresy moot, yet her audience can learn from the make-believe in heaven to be better devotees on earth, and given that, the ecclesiastics and the Inquisition could let the show go on. Let me end with an example in which Juana de la Cruz, or Jesus if you believe, directly addresses images as focal objects in a network. In Sermon 9, on the parable of the landowner who hires day laborers to work in his vineyard and pays them the same whether they start in the morning or the late afternoon, Jesus declares to the angels that he wants to, quote, elect and make a major domo, a steward to help him hire the day laborers. The angels expect him to choose one of them as the steward, or failing that, a human. But he responds impatiently that he had not said he was going to elect and create a major domo, but elect and make one, because creation belongs to God alone, but making is a quality shared by God and humans. The angels bring him a large piece of ivory, and from it Jesus fashions a sculpture which resembles him in every detail of the face and limbs. Immediately after it is sculpted, a crystal belt or sash appears around its loins, signifying the virginity and purity of Mary who gave him flesh. The angels ask whether he is going to make a new world for his new human, and he explains that this is not a living human, but an image which will walk, move, and even bubble when and only when Jesus commands it to do so, shades of Pygmalion and Galatea. Jesus then sends out the image into the world as his steward to seek those willing to work in his vineyard, at which point it transforms into a bleeding crucifix that calls out to devotees to follow it in passionate mini-sermons. Juana goes on to explain that every image of Jesus during his passion, whether praying in Gethsemane or flagellated in the column, functions as the major domo of God, summoning people to follow him regardless of how late they have left it. The enchantment of material culture demonstrated here reveals Jesus as the sculptor of material appeals to believe in him. It reinforces how the material culture of Catholicism in Inquisition Spain created a network between humans and objects and the divinity that created the former and made the latter, a network that draws the listener and viewer into a festival day, an expanded biblical narrative that enchants even as it saves. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to the FHI and to Professor Morgan for the invitation twice to talk about this wonderful book. And I'm also particularly honored because even though David Morgan is not an archaeologist, maybe he's the professor in the entire university that reads more archaeological theory. So that makes reading the book even more exciting for me. So to the book. The title of the book, Images at Work, seemed to imply that David Morgan's latest publication discusses mainly visual culture, but it does much more than that. In this monograph, the author makes us think about images, not only as visual entities, but also as objects, and even devices and technologies of enchantment. To that, he adds an important insight, that images that enchant us and open doors to worlds of make-believe belong to both the material world and the realm of things that are half invisible, such as vision or sometimes not really seen at all, like the aura of iconic objects or our own misinterpretation of reality. David Morgan has found substance in the shadows and put back in the enmeshed networks of human and non-human actors studied by sociologists and archaeologists, things that are not always understood from a rational point of view. Yet, these things influence in important ways the way we see the world and the way we behave in it. It doesn't matter if the images at work around us are real or not. If they are part of our reality, they should be included in our analysis of social networks to investigate what we do to images as much as what images do to us. In the first page of the book, David Morgan introduces the central question of the relationship between representation and essence, using the story of Narcissus, who, according to Ovid, quote, saw an image in a pool and fell in love with that unembodied hope, and found substance in what was only a shadow. He looked in wonder, spellbound, and no more moving than any marble statue, end quote. The living image in the pool transformed Narcissus into his representation. He turned into his own stone replica. The magic of the image was so powerful as to metamorph the real thing into its reflection, and the reflection into the real thing. In the last chapter, Morgan sums up the inner workings of the apparently deceiving technologies of enchantment. Quote, I suggest that enchantment is non-rational work toward making a home in the universe. The task of enchantment is to suspend disbelief and rearrange the conditions of the world or conjure another as true. Images come to life as dream, act upon us, then fade into the background to become the ordinary world we know and rely on. The result is a sense of belonging, the real work of enchantment. The book delves into theory of the image, but goes beyond many of them, since it is concerned, like David Fredberg's The Power of Images, with images as objects and visual technologies. David Morgan, however, is not primarily preoccupied, like Fredberg, with a theory of response to images, but intends to understand the mechanisms that make them work in the way they do. In the same way, Morgan's book is in clear dialogue with archaeological and material theories about thing agency, but complement them with, by adding what they leave aside, the culturally embedded making of the immaterial. This has been explored only very recently, for example, by Victor Buckley in his book An Archaeology of the Immaterial, published in 2016. However, Severin Falls was probably the first to point out already in 2010 that, quote, think theory's major blind spot is quite literally that which is unseen, or rather that which is absent but nevertheless experienced as presence, precisely because it's absent, is marked or emphatic, end quote. Falls expressed his worry that in the rush to take things seriously, we have overprivileged a crude notion of presence linked to physically and tangibly materials, and that this new materialism tends to blind us to that more complicated world of relations in which, packed between the multitudes of self-evident things, are crowds of non-things and entity-like presences, end quote, which are indeed contended in David Morgan's book. Archaeologists such as Bjornar Olsen, Chris Gosten, and John Robb has raised the question, what do objects want? And try to understand the effect of things' agency, the enchantment of irresistible objects in antiquity and the present. While others, such as Tim Ingold, have dismissed the idea of the agency of things in favor of actions derived from the properties of their materials. Severin Falls has also been very critical with theories that treat non-human objects as quasi-human subjects that are represented by the authority of archaeologists in the same fashion that non-Western peoples used to be represented by anthropologists before the post-colonial critiques of the 1980s. What kind of influence have things on us? How comes, asked David Morgan in his book, that we are mesmerized by the representation of a beautiful body in a statue, that we see God in an icon, that we are frightened by a movie, that we are even able to envision ourselves as different people if we could only own a commodity that is advertised to us? How do images work? His answer revolves around three central concepts that receive detailed analysis in the book: enchantment, focal objects, and networks. Enchantment has always something to do with representations, dreams, delusion, and the power they exert over us. But David Morgan reveals how, I quote, enchantment does the reverse of living the ordinary world. It changes one relationship to the world as real in order to suit one's need. And it does so without admitting to any departure for the land of the haunted castles or hungry trolls, end quote. In this view of enchantment, quote, enchantment does not consist in substituting a fantasy for reality, but of bending reality to fit some reimagined coordinates. Focal objects, objects of desire, are responsible both of producing enchantment and rendering invisible the networks of people and things that made them possible in the first place. We learn from David Morgan that these objects can only be correctly interpreted in the ecology of images, in the network of things and objects in which they operate and from which they derive their meaning. To conclude, one of the main contributions of the book might be the theoretical articulation of a material world in which images should be considered as objects. But an actually important breakthrough is the statement that any analysis of enchantment needs to be severed from the idea of truth if we want to be able to focus on the real effects of images in our lives. Almost finished. So that's the last paragraph, and it's also at the very, it's one of the kernels of the book, in my opinion. Quoting again David Morgan, I would like a definition of enchantment that, this is in page 20, does not limit animation to an irrational misperception or a delusory distortion of reality, but underscores instead the importance of change achieved by various means in the world we inhabit. And again, in page 29, imagination produces more than reverie. It manufactures what people take to be real, want to be real, and make real by concerted belief and practice. Thank you very much.
So I'm entitling my response to David Morgan's stunning book, Cruel Enchantment, which I have plundered from Lauren Berlant, and I'm hoping that she will forgive me for that, and I hope it will become clear why I've done that. So walking into the History of the Bible exhibit at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., visitors are given the opportunity to view not only an enviable collection of ancient and medieval manuscripts, but also a set of banners affirming the value of the objects on view. These biblical slogans, distributed liberally throughout the exhibit, emphasize the Bible's own self-referential truth, placing the displays below in high relief and signifying the canonical significance of each object. Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments of papyri, illuminated manuscripts, medieval copies of the Vulgate, Torah scrolls, and early printed Bibles become, in this framing, opportunities for reflection on the important evangelical Protestant principle: the Christian Bible speaks for itself and as itself, revealing God's words to those ready to receive it. As such, to borrow language from David Morgan's amazing Images at Work, this exhibit invites viewers to enter an enchanted world where the Bible is a magical device as it appeared intact from heaven, bearing nothing but the inerrant words of its divine author. Those who are at home in this museum discover that focal objects like P39, one of the oldest papyrus fragments of the Gospel of John, enfold them into an infrastructure of relationships with God, the Bible, and one another. Looking at a fragmentary papyrus, they see an icon of the really real. I mention this example by way of thanks. While reading Images at Work in preparation for this panel, I was also attempting to finish an essay I had agreed to write last spring on New Testament textual criticism and the museum's Scholars Initiative. As it turned out, working on these two projects at once helped me with both, and in ways I had not anticipated. And so it is with sincere gratitude that I participate in this conversation today, not only because David's book was and is every bit as inspiring and provocative as I expected it would be, but also because I couldn't have managed that other essay without him. And so, in honor of Images at Work, as read alongside my own interactions with the Museum of the Bible, I am entitling my response Cruel Enchantment. In Cruel Optimism, Lauren Berlant diagnoses a particular kind of optimism, the kind in which the optimistic attachment is no longer sustained by the arrival of a desired object, but by the optimism itself. Optimism is a force that moves you out of yourself and into the world, and optimistic attachments might involve the fantasy of a good life or a political project. Cruel optimism, however, actually makes it impossible to attain the expansive transformations for which a person or a people risks striving, withdrawing the possibility that ignited the striving to begin with. So, to borrow an example from David's book, a person might wait, like Dorothy in Oz, for a Kansas that really is home, a mother who really does love her, a farm that has not been destroyed by a tornado or a bank loan, and a bed that is actually safe and warm. This Dorothy might find that she is thoroughly enchanted by a sustaining inclination to return to the scene of the fantasy, in the hope that this time, nearness to this thing, will help her or world become different in just the right way. In the closing scene of Images at Work, David turns to the example of Dorothy to explore the enduring tension between enchantment and disenchantment. For Dorothy, deliverance did not arrive until the lie of the wizard was exposed. Only then could she discover that her ruby slippers were her real focal object, that is, the agent of her transformation that would enable her to return home. Disenchantment with the wizard and with Oz meant re-enchantment with home. She followed her story, found her values, regained her vision, and through her dream, found herself. Enchantment for Dorothy and for all of us is a means of survival. But survival to what? For what? For whom? And under what terms? Enchantment is a procedure that produces results, David observes. Disenchantment can be a useful means of opposing other people's enchantments and securing one's own. In the interplay of enchantments, we do things with things, and things are done to us. For Dorothy, the enchanting return was to a home that the real wizard of her story, Frank Baum, had created for her. a conservative one, which, as David points out, the traditional arrangements of rural life were restored, despite the fact that such arrangements were slipping away and were already gone. As interactive technologies, images are good at enchantment. So too are novels like The Wizard of Oz, which tells the story of an enchantment that enchants, imagining a world for Dorothy and for us that can no longer be and maybe never was. But what if I don't want to be enchanted? This is not my home. I am frightened of that home. Images at Work has convinced me. Enchantment is about survival. Everyone is enchanted. Otherwise, no one is ever at home, could ever find a home, whatever David Hume might say. There's no getting over enchantment, no purified place of pure reason where, with the iconoclast, the dream of destroying the fake, the superficial, the reproduced, the derivative, and the delusion can be achieved. Indeed, the iconoclast dream is also a form of enchantment, complete with a make-believe purity, a set of images and books, and a pedestal upon which, to borrow Bruno Latour's term, a factish god can be placed. Images at Work help me see this more clearly. It's in Protestant Christianity and in the United States, religious metamorphosis is accomplished by science, where the factish God and God are intermingled in a warm embrace. Behind iconoclasm is a shared strategy of violent intervention designed to awaken the bemused from their compulsion or hallucination, revealing the targeted enchantment to be merely an illusory projection of desire. This is a big, long quote of David with me mixed in. You just want that, the playground bully chants. You totally made that up. But, David says, pedestals do not remain empty for long. And in the Museum of the Bible, at least, the pedestal gets a scientish Bible, a technical wonderland, and a purple palace of the delightful real. Iconoclasm in the Bible as icon produce a collaborative edifice where some pristine version of Frank Baum's Kansas can enchant us once again. Of course, this palace is not new, nor is it unique to this museum. Researching my essay, I came across any number of 19th and early 20th century Protestant textual critics, Bible scholars, and professors of church history ready to remind me, for example, that God providentially wasted no miracles by preserving autographed copies of the New Testament books. Instead, history's ruins left documentary evidence, namely surviving manuscripts, that await subjection to the diligence and research of man so that the divine word can be restored and God's true desires revealed. Ask me about the bird later. As Philip Schaff, professor at Union Theological Seminary and the founder of the American Society of Church History, declared in 1881, the science of textual criticism demonstrates not that the Bible has been lost to us, but that God, quote, desires free and intelligent worshipers. I'm skipping that part to here. Okay. If my reading informed by David's work is correct, secular New Testament scholarship and the Museum of the Bible have more enchantment in common than I might otherwise have noticed. Both, it seems, participates in what Webb Keane has called the moral narrative of modernity, a story about human emancipation and self-mastery that overturns the false beliefs and fetishisms that undermined freedom in the past, which is one of the reasons that I find myself worrying about Dorothy. This moral narrative is not innocent. Modern enchantment by modernity, privatizes belief and the body in such a way that human differences are simultaneously erased and turned into focal objects of our utmost concern. As Lionel Cady and Tracy Fessenden put it, quote, the body becomes positioned between religion and the secular state, such that the moral regulation of the body by religion becomes a sign of the state's own good works. The ostensibly secular state is therefore both a theologian and a biologist, employing the scalpel of reason to slice open souls or to peer behind every iconostasis to see what's there. And meanwhile, Dorothy is enchanted by rallies and stories and cultural icons that bend her and us into a collective we, such that, paraphrasing David, that network is forgotten behind the mask. What are we supposed to do when the enchantment is cruel? Is there some other, less violent response, or must one always pick up the iconoclast's angry tire iron and start swinging? Before I went to Columbia to begin the doctoral program in religion, I worked for a time in early childhood education, advocating for and with preschool teachers and family daycare providers in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia. I loved the job. I learned so much from the people I worked with, the kids we tried to support, the methods we developed to trick governments and philanthropists into paying for services that, it was obvious to me, were both desperately needed and totally worth it. At the time, I was reading a lot of educational theory and books about play, including works by Winnicott, also mentioned by David in Images at Work. I was most thoroughly enchanted, however, by the writings of Vivian Paley, a preschool and kindergarten teacher at the University of Chicago Lab School. Two stories she tells have particularly stayed with me. The story about the boy who would be a helicopter, and the year Paley and her fellow teachers instituted the strict rule, you can't say, you can't play. Last paragraph. As David reminds us, play is quite serious. It helps children come to terms with what frightens them and fosters a state of concentrated consciousness that provokes empowering experiences of self and others. In fact, play isn't childish at all. Like enchantment, and as enchantment, it's necessary for survival. Perhaps religion scholars should make a habit of reading about that play, and particularly about the boy who would be a helicopter. I wish I lived in Vivian Paley's preschool class. I wish I had a teacher who would invent a rule like you can't say, you can't play, and work tirelessly with the children to imagine how such a rule can be lived. But in the meantime, the enchantments of the Bible in America frighten me, and I don't want to play. I would rather be a make-believe helicopter than an actual Bible, and I would like to disenchant certain forms of enchantment. But in the meantime, I am glad for this invitation to think about enchantment, images, assemblages, and play. And with the help of David's book, to fashion a world closer to home, one that may someday actually be one. Thank you.
Jenny makes me feel like I should have brought a few images to bring with me, because actually I thought of them while I was sitting there, and I wish I had them. And now I just may have to describe them as best as I can to illuminate a couple points that I want to make. What a delight it was reading David's book. Through the winter break, I should say, and also refreshing my memory in preparation for this event today. I'm the historian at the table, and I feel an obligation to point out that one of the things that David's book accomplishes, if you're really thinking as an historian, is that he's adding one more nail to the coffin of secularization and modernization that has so animated the writing of contemporary history since the Enlightenment. And those of you who've ever had an undergraduate history class, those of you who write professional history like myself, those of you who are modern historians, or if you just pick up a work of modern history, one of the things that you will be drawn into, even unwittingly and unaware that most historians make this assumption, is that since the Enlightenment, the modern West, Europe, and America have been secularized. It's the grand secularization thesis, and it is so pervasive in the writing of modern European history and American history that whole topics never get explored. Whole question areas are left aside because they don't fit. The blinders that the secularization theory has imposed upon modern historians, and I think of myself in that camp, although my research goes back to the 15th century, it's amazing, because once you take the blinders off, and that's exactly what David's work suggests that we do, you begin to realize we don't understand just how enchanted the modern world actually is. But it's even more interesting to that and even more complicated than that. And the reason why is that David offers in his book not a theory, not an approach to this problem of enchantment and disenchantment, but he looks at it as something that underpins religion. It assumes and can help us understand religious practices and beliefs, but also cultural engagements that we make as well. And let me just give you an example from my own personal biography, for example. When I was living in Florence about 10 years ago, we had passes to the Uffizi Museum, and we could go right to the head of the line. And in the course of my living there, I now have the language, David, for what started to happen to me. I became enchanted by a painting. Now, I'm a thoroughly modern man. I like to think of myself that way. I know that I'm not, probably. But this painting began to draw my attention. It happens to be a painting that's not often written about by Leonardo da Vinci. It's his Annunciation. And he did it when he was a very young man. It's one of the first paintings of his that we have. And it absolutely captivated me. And I stopped going to other galleries in the Uffizi because I always wanted to go re-encounter the Virgin Mary, reading a book, pausing, looking calmly, catching the eye of Michael, who is announcing that she will be carrying God's child. It is an astonishing... Gabriel, I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't have anything written out, so thank you for the question. Gabriel. And then I found myself so taken with this image, I started to go on a pilgrimage across Florence to different galleries and museums looking for images of the Annunciation, trying to figure out what is it about this particular painting that captured me. And I'll come to this point, this is my third point I'll make in just a few minutes, that David makes, and so powerfully, it changes my whole relationship to paintings, not just to religious activities, objects, and so on and so forth. And that is that images assert their own agency on you, the viewer, even when it is against your will. Even when you think your conscious mind is analyzing a painting or an image, you are responding to it unconsciously. And David, and you cannot resist, you cannot stop yourself. David has a beautiful illustration of this process with a discussion of a photograph in his book. And this is set right in the time period of the waning moment of spiritualism in the early 20th century in Britain. And the interesting thing about spiritualism, some of you may know, is that it takes hold precisely at a time and in places where it should not, if you're an historian focused on secularization and modernization. It takes hold among often educated classes. It takes hold in cities that are rapidly urbanizing and becoming big impersonal cities. And it's taking place in cities that are becoming industrial cities as well. These are the classic places that historians have described as places where secularization and the kind of the waning influence of religion takes hold. But precisely there is where spiritualism has one of its holds. And David discusses one object, one photograph, which when you look at it, you simply cannot resist. And I'll try and describe it. It is of a photograph of an elderly couple sitting calmly next to each other, and hovering between them is a ghostly figure, a woman, a female figure, who's hovering over them. And you're not sure. You see, I've already gotten enchanted by the photograph, because you start wondering. As human beings, David suggests, we cannot resist faces, looking for emotions, and instinctively, and against your very finely tuned intellectual mind, Duke professors and graduate students, right? You think you can resist the power of stories and narratives? You cannot. They assert a power and a control over you, and already you're asking questions. What is the story that is in this photograph? Even if you are disenchanted and know that spirit photography is done through all kinds of technical tricks and devices of the photographer, but you can't resist thinking about what is really going on here. And it's a suspension of disbelief that you find yourself going through. What is so helpful about this is that David points out that enchantment is a vital part, ongoing part of modern cultures. It's not just a religious process, it's also a cultural process. The second thing that I want to draw your attention to, not just the historical point, but one of the theories that he draws upon to develop this, which for me was really eye-opening and very, very useful. David makes very, I think, brilliant use of actor network theory, which was new to me, by the way, because I'm not a theory head. As microhistorian, I'm really interested in the messiness of everyday human experiences, not theoretical constructs. But actor network theory for David really becomes central to understanding the process of enchantment. Now you may ask, what is actor network theory? And this is where it's really, I think he makes a really brilliant use of this theory to point out that enchantment happens in a network. It's not a process of belief, a psychological process, you might think, and it's encounter with an external world. We like to think that belief is something primary and you should start with. But no, by using really actor network theory, David points out that not just human actors, but non-human actors are drawn into and created by focal objects in a process of enchantment. Like for me, I didn't realize that I was creating a whole network of meaning and relationships and other paintings to this Leonardo, and then conversations that I had. It goes on to the present day, by the way. But when David was using and suggesting that it's not belief we should be focused on, it's the network that's created in the process of enchantment, whole worlds of understanding became clear for me. What happens is that you, the viewer, drawn to an object, can be pain. This is an entirely, doesn't have to be a religious process at all, as it was for me. It was just being drawn to a painting. Get drawn into a world of relationships, emotional feelings, suggested connections, perhaps to other people, but maybe they are to texts. Maybe they are to, in my case, other paintings, or maybe to statues, or to churches. I almost went and looked for churches dedicated to the Annunciation of the Virgin around Florence. I have too many to visit in the time I was there, but nonetheless, that's exactly it. It's in this world of connections. And here's where I think David's use of the theory is so brilliant. Instead of invoking a theory of belief, he points out that we understand enchantment and disenchantment by looking at the networks that are created and disassembled in the process. And why this is so important for me as an historian is this. Belief you can almost never prove or show. It is a psychological assumption. We think we have evidence of it when you read a document, a text, see a painting, but actually these are just tenuous things and they're very easy to project onto evidence, a psychological state of mind. And actually, what David suggests is that you can be drawn into a whole network of enchantment and not necessarily believe. It's the actions, it's the relationships, it's the emotions that are evoked. It's even, as Jenny was just kind of resisting here, it's your resistance. You're drawn into, and you have to enter into this conversation with an object. And then finally, I'll make just this one last point. Here, I wish that I had a painting up here, two paintings actually I'm thinking of, because what David points out in the Material Culture of Enchantment is that objects have agency. I just let that sink in. Objects have agency. For me, this dislodges me from thinking about the object I'm interested in, using even a weak version of linguistic theory and looking for signs that a painting may just be a collection of signs, which is all very, very intellectual, by the way, and points you in different paintings and texts. You can draw. No. The actor has agency, the object has agency, and it evokes an emotional response. It evokes relationships that you can choose to follow or not develop. And I'll close with just this one example of a painting that enchanted me in my new project, which is about a German peasant woman, died very young, tragically young. She was called the Seeress of Provorst, grew up in a German pietist village in the between 1800, and she dies at the age of 29, actually. And the last 5 years of her life, probably 10 years, but the last 5 years for sure, she was in a somnambulic state. She was sleeping, or sleepwalking, or sleepwaking. There's a whole complex vocabulary there. So extraordinary were the events that took place in her presence and around her that she became a focal point of piety and fascination by scientists, physicians, natural philosophers who made a pilgrimage to Provence to see her in person. By that time, a physician had become so totally enchanted by her, he had moved her into his house, and he and his wife took care of her. Yes, I know she was also physically ill, but all kinds of paranormal activity were recorded. It was exquisitely described in the physician's notebooks. And what happened before she died, paintings started to appear. And actually, she made the transition, still living, from being a human actor to being a painting, an object, and a focal point of enchantment. You can go to Provence and go to the house. The house is an enchanted focal point now too, but the two paintings of her are absolutely riveting, and you can't look at them and not wonder what kind of a person and her life and experiences are you being drawn into here. One, she's laying out asleep on her bed, arms folded, and you had the feeling you're in the presence of someone who's experiencing life in the world in a way that you can only hint at. And David is really keen about pointing out that sometimes with these enchantments, it's what's hinted at, suggested at, still just beyond being touchable or present, that the most powerful enchantments take place. Thank you, David, for this wonderful book.
Just a full, robust round of thanks to everyone. Thank you for coming. It's a delight to see you here, and I want to thank Ranji and Deborah for the invitation. It's really my pleasure. Thank you so much for your introduction. And thanks to these folks who did, I'm flattered and touched. You really read the book seriously, and I love the way you overlay it with your work and engage it in dialogue. What more does a scholar want than to see the work engage smart people in their own thoughts? So it's a delight. I'm going to keep this extremely short because I would really like to hear from you all. But just let me affirm, I think all of you really hit on critical themes. I'm delighted to know that the themes came through. The book, in that sense, worked. The whole issue, Jess, you were raising about making believe to believe is at the heart of the project, and I think your application to these sermons is really wonderful. I love this. We tend to take religion so seriously sometimes, in part because it can be. They kill people and they do some nasty things. On the other hand, religion is playful and delightful and inventive and fueled by fantasy. And, I think you've really hit on a perfect case. This is really wonderful. I think I can't wait to see this in print. This is great. Alicia, thank you. You touched on Friedberg, who for me was a kind of a Pauline experience, on the road to Damascus. I just finished graduate school, and a reading group at Chicago wanted to read this brand new book, David Friedberg's. And I was in art history at the time, and I thought, well, yeah, I got to read this. This looks really interesting. It's a gigantic, way too long book, but it was a wake-up call. I mean, for me, it was kind of a corner to turn. But I haven't stopped turning, and I think you put your finger on it. There's the one thing that, there are a few things that bother me about the book now. Still a lot. I still assign it. I think I'm reading it with somebody this semester. It's a significant piece of work. But the problem with this theory of response idea is that it misses the articulated sociality of reception. He doesn't engage reception of viewers and look at what real viewers do with images in front of them, and he's more interested in a psychological or philosophical theory of response. Interesting in its own right, obviously, but it just is, over time I've realized that's not what I'm doing. And I think you picked on it very nicely in your comments on networks and enchantment. Jetty, it was a delight to see this. I thought, I hadn't thought about the museum, but I still have to get there. But I hear from several folks in your neck of the woods, folks in biblical studies, that it's variously fascinating, offensive, insulting, interesting. So I really have to get there. But as I was looking at the image, it was striking, that P39 piece. You realize how this object that, evangelical preachers beat on their podiums and people are so proud of and hug and kiss and die for, you realize it's this frail, complex device strung over centuries and centuries and centuries. It's one of the most complex networks I can imagine, given the number of manuscripts that are in partial shape, spread over centuries, in a passel of languages. And what does it take? This is what interests me. What does it take to pull all of that together and enchant it as what I would call a magical book, this finished thing that really, if you talk to some folks, dropped out of heaven, and that's a profound process that really, I find endlessly interesting. How does that happen? And then what's fascinating, I take it, about the museum is that it's part of a complex process of re-enchantment. This may be the evangelical response to you all, Mark Goodacre and Jenny, all you people who dissect this object and look at it, you, in some sense, disenchant it because you're absolutely concerned with showing its contingency, its historicity, the degree to which it is rooted in particular communities over time, the work of good scholarship. But then, what I find so interesting is this vacillation. We break it down, it comes back together. Enchantment, disenchantment are always happening. Re-enchantment, it's a fascinating process. And thank you so much, Tom. You read the book very, very carefully, and delighted. The case with Leonardo, that's a wonderful one. I remember the first time I stood in front of a Rembrandt as a college student, and I was just dumbstruck. I didn't know exactly what was happening to me, but I like very much this idea. I'm a social constructionist, but with things. I get so tired of the linguistic emphasis on ascription, as if just saying it makes it. It's stuff, it's the affordances of things, the way they push back, the way they, they seduce us, the way they offend us and hurt us. The reality, the materiality of the world is what's fascinating, and I think you captured that very nicely. And I love what you said about the German pietist and the sort of relationship between the person and the image. This, of course, is a powerful process in the formation of Catholic saints. You can think of other visual cultures. I think of Fayum and the Roman Hellenistic Egyptian images, the mummy portraits that were painted, sometimes before the people died, and then after they're dead, they were attached to their mummified bodies and became the interface with the dead and kept on living in a new kind of way. So these images are powerful and infused with mysteries and irrationality that I quite agree. We shouldn't scoff at and walk away and think I'm a modern rational human being. I don't do that crap. In fact, that's religion happening. So you miss the boat if you don't take that stuff seriously. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
And one of the things that you point out in your book that is so difficult for anyone who wants to recognize or even discuss enchantment, it's always about something else or some other culture or a religion that we're not a part of. It's not what we do. And are recognizing this process of enchantment is actually, it's a process that underpins everyday life, even among highly secularized, seemingly, academics. But one of the things I would add to your conversation that happens in the writing process, you are also reconnecting to whole networks of people you know, colleagues you know, books that you want to go consult, conferences, places you want to go to, and so on, and it will live with you as a network, this book, for a long time to come, David.
Oh, that's great. To connect this conversation, I think of text as textiles, They remind me of these vellum or papyri, they're and they unravel and you remend them and you keep them together. It's a kind of ongoing project of maintenance to keep the gestalt there, because that's the tipping point when it comes back to you. It's fascinating. Yeah.
I was curious to hear your thoughts about how your theory of enchantment might interact with objects specifically designed to enchant, like amulets, for example, something you would keep on your person, which was meant to have like an actual effect on the person wearing them.
Yeah, well, those are fascinating objects because they pull together a variety of resources, communities, makers, and particular kinds of texts. Often, you think of Jewish at the door, mezuzah. Yeah, it's got a scroll of Torah in it. A friend of mine, Justin McGannon, who had intended to come in the last iteration of this or version of this, has worked a lot on Thai Buddhist amulets and does a really interesting analysis of the worlds these objects pass through to get to you when you buy one actually in that case rent them. You rent these amulets. Is quite interesting. It's an object that's picked up a lot of value over time, depending on who made it, when, where, under what conditions, what it was made of, what kind of relics it might include. These are complex objects that are great examples of what I call the focal object, this thing that is a node, and so that it's the site at which you interface with that unseen network. It comes to you and as a kind of presence, as you were talking about. So they're great examples, amulets, I think.
So I'm wondering whether literary texts or other texts have the same kind of possibility of enchantment, or whether there's something qualitatively different that you would want to put forward in relation to literary texts. And, I mean, I think that what you were talking about was this way in which they become object, right? So, yeah, it's slightly
I have some response, but if I don't want to deal with more comments.
Well, I guess I think one thing that David's book helped me see that I hadn't really thought through, I didn't have a vocabulary. Which is why a great scholarly work is one that helps you see what you've been trying to see and you hadn't been able to, and I felt that way reading David's book. And I actually think that in light of what David is suggesting, that the attempt to pretend that the text isn't an object is precisely the enchantment, the movement of enchantment. So it's like we constantly have to pretend that the text transcends its object status, and in that imaginary transcendence is where the enchantment's taking place. But it needs to be articulated and embodied in its object in order for the enchantment of the transcendent object to even exist, right? So that is one thing I got from your book.
I think, for instance, of recitation of poetry, you transform the text into the performed voice, and it changes the poem. The poem's not the same. It's something else. There's a presence to it. It's a sonic presence. And I remember my very pious father reading the Red Letter Bible. Every word of Jesus in the Gospels was in red. And we always had to sit through long readings of the Easter story. And when we would get to Jesus, suddenly his voice would change. It would deepen, slow, articulate, enunciate everything. I thought, I was like, Jesus suddenly was in the room. So there was, or at very least, you had to stop messing around with my annoying sister and listen, because something had changed. So the performance of the text is often a mode of enchantment, I think.
I really was interested in the way that you referenced sort of like the network theory and the idea of enchantment. And I was wondering how we think about, we all talked a lot about the sort of human experience of being enchanted. If we think about network theory and objects having agency, do we need to develop a framework or vocabulary for thinking about the way that the object then experiences that enchantment or is enchanted, right? Like sort of in the reverse, right? Like if the text as objects enchant us, but like what does that enchantment look like in the other direction? Or maybe that's not something we need to talk about.
Well, I mean, I think of Tom Mitchell asking, what do images want? That would be one place I would go to pursue your question. And of course, the new materialists are very interested in these various levels of molecular chemical activity, and these are all really fascinating questions. I don't have a single final answer to that. I just think that any moment one says, draws a line, says, I won't go beyond that, for me becomes really the point of analysis. I'm really interested when people say, no, I won't do that. Why? You know, I want to know what's going on. So if you run into folks who simply scoff that notion off, scoff at that notion, then I think it's something needs to be explained. And that's interesting.
So you talk about enchantment in a general sense, in culture and religion as a whole, but also within different religious traditions, there are developed theories about how does an image work, say the theory of icons in Orthodox Christianity. So how would a general idea of enchantment interplay with specific religious contexts and those contexts, theologies of enchantment? Is Jewish enchantment different from Christian enchantment, different from Buddhist enchantment, or is it even, I'm assuming, more local than those big words, Judaism, Buddhism? So, curious for your thoughts.
I would say yes, it's going to be different in every case. It means not only different in a religion, but historicized within one tradition or one sect. And absolutely, that kind of particularity is indispensable to capture in scholars. I haven't thought much about theologies of enchantment. I don't do any theology. I read a lot of it because it's relevant, obviously, but if you're talking about from a constructive perspective, I just don't know what that is. I'd be interested to know. I'm just more interested in the dramaturgy and the sort of the construction of the scene, the stage, how these objects, images are deployed, who sees them when, under what conditions. You know, it's a matter of stepping back and looking at the stage, you know, like Irving Kaufman kind of thing. Just set the full stage and do ethnography where you can, or sort of ethnographic thinking with historical sources. And, it's what I was talking about, reception versus response, I guess.
And if I could just amplify the point about historical context being absolutely vital. What, even in a long tradition, but I'm familiar with the Christian one, what would enchant one century or one moment or one region of Europe or one village in a region is not going to work someplace else. And this is when you want to understand the process, you really have to understand I realize from reading you, a whole host of things. So, for example, I'm thinking of the case I'm working on. There's a whole set of sensibilities that had come into play in the course of the 18th or 19th century. You have to understand how they work with women and how they are about women in order to understand why this woman becomes an object of enchantment for so many people, even people who aren't religious or Protestant at all. And it's the sensibilities that were valued, cultivated, written about, performed, familiar to people at that particular time. They somehow, I think, played a really important part in the process of enchantment in Friederike Haufmann's case. And if I think about other cases, you really have to understand the specificity of it, because you point out it's not just one thing. It involves the senses, it involves relationships, and those can be constructed or deconstructed in different ways in different communities, in different time periods, and emotions and the way that they work at a particular time, or the way you smell, for example, and value scent. In the 12th century, there was a different experience of smelling incense from what it is in the 20th century, for example. Or the experience of space, light, and darkness, and how they're valued or not valued. I think all these things are really valuable, very specific in particular times.
There is a chapter on icons in the book, if you're interested, and I do look at Orthodox icons and set them beside cultural icons, non-religious icons. Annabelle.
Is ideology a different form of enchantment, one that embraces politics rather than politics?
Oh, absolutely, and I don't deal with politics throughout the text. I mean, literally politics. But I do have this section that looks at the Russian Revolution and the surge to destroy Christian temple or churches and particularly icons and religious iconography. I also have that another section that looks at the role of disenchantment in the Spanish Revolution and the loyalists versus the rebels, and particularly the targeting of Sacred Heart of Jesus as a case where the political relevance of this, I think, is direct. The statuary of the Sacred Heart became a primary target for hitting a vast network of church loyalists across the country. And so to destroy the focal object is in effect, a symbolic strike at the entire network. With the idea is that it's an extremely political act, iconoclasm, I argue, because if you destroy the means of interface, that's the best way to destroy the network it serves. So I think of iconoclasm as a fundamentally political act. So yeah, it's not in every chapter certainly, but there I think particularly where I try to explain disenchantment. I think it comes in quite relevant. And I think your point about ideology is, yes, indeed, it is a form of political enchantment.
Yes. Well, you say that thing about the pedestal doesn't remain empty for long.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was so helpful that, even the people who are engaged in all this disenchantment at the same time are enchanting others, right? So that's part of the way the process works.
Yeah.
Which is why I was joking with you, like, can I get out my tire iron and bang it on the Museum of the Bible? It's not going to do me any good, right? Yeah.
Just wondering, and this could be for various panelists as well, what do you all think about the relationship between enchantment and habitus, given that an enchantment could be long-lasting, it could be deeply forming, not just for individual lives, but for communal life and social infrastructures and so forth. And secondly, what do you think that enchantment ought to be restricted to humans, or even to any, only to things with consciousness?
Well, I have dogs, and my wife and I are constantly struck by their intelligence and their enchantments and the life that they lead. So I certainly wouldn't restrict it to human beings. And I like very much the post-human turn. It's very healthy and quite helpful. In terms of the habitus, it's an interesting thing to consider. If you think of what Bourdieu talked about as the hysteresis, the tendency for key features of a habitus, certain practices, to resist change. There's something inherently conservative about the habitus. It doesn't like to change. Sometimes it has to. I mean, I am animating it, but and there is something about certain modes of enchantment, I think, that steadfastly resist change. You think of religion, generally, is often an inherently conservative social construct. It does not like to change. So I think there needs to be a constant maintenance to re-enchant it, renew it, refurbish it, recharge it, discover the constant renewal process that reinvests it with cultural presence and salience in order to keep the habitus in place.
And could I say that the habitus also keeps enchantments in place? And I can see them working hand in glove. And I think of it, for example, as a really helpful way to weave them together to explain lots of everyday activities that endure for very, very long periods of time. Pilgrimages, for example. And you don't have to, in a way that I think the term enchantment is a little misleading because to me it implies an extraordinary state of mind. But that's my problem, that's not David's. David is saying, but a habitus implies you can feel things, you have many different motives, but you're doing the same thing, right? And I think of pilgrimages that remain in place for centuries. And even recently, knowing someone who went on a pilgrimage not with the intention of having belief invoked or an enchantment created by it, but because the landscape was beautiful and the weather was nice and you meet interesting people. Your notion of enchantment with networks that can be enduring is so helpful because you don't have to have this extraordinary state of mind or emotion constantly in play for it to work. In fact, habitus can explain why some enchantments are so enduring for such a long time.
That you have to, it cannot last. It should not last very long, I think. And I don't know how to quantify the temporal. Right? It's like your example, Tom, of you going, seeing the Da Vinci painting, and then you have to step out of it to, I think, realize that you were in this enchanted mood. You cannot be in that forever and ever, which is why I don't think
That's a kind of liminal space you don't stay in, but you come
I
back.
think that's why it's, the Bourdieu question is an interesting one for us to think about the temporality of this, it's.
Well, this is why. This is why Durkheim needed to take material culture more seriously. He's got this scheme about collective efforts being invested in the totem. But if he would have expanded it and told us more about it, I think we would learn the capacity of material culture to reignite the enchantment and sustain it episodically.
Episodically,
Yeah.
Episodically.
And I think that's one of the things that was so interesting in your use. Sorry. I think that was one of the things that was so interesting in your use of enchantment is that it's actually things enchant.
Right.
We are conflating it back into people do magical things or have an approach to something. Fine, but it's that the thing is doing that.
And you are
And so it's
contact
temporal but
with it,
spatial.
or you're-
Right, so it becomes
Yeah.
temporal when you step away.
Exactly.
If you leave the Uffizi, then your approach to that thing is going to shift by spatially.
I wanted to ask you about that, actually, about the agency of things and how you see us progressing in terms of a theoretical understanding of this, because in a way, this post-humanist turn is making things just like people. So we are, giving them agency, they have desires, they have biographies, there is the language of things. Can we create a new theory of the agency of things that is more nuanced in the sense of not just applying to them all these human attributes and start seeing different type of agencies attached to different type of agents? Where do you see us going?
Object-oriented ontology.
Yeah.
Well, I think Latour is the one who's taught me the most about this. I mean, I've read more of his stuff on this, and I like the idea of, a lot of cognitive science. We're looking at the human being. We're unfinished. We have this capacity to interface. So our environment completes us, and it participates with us actively in the construction of experience and meaning. We're not this sovereign mind ascribing significance. It's far more interactive, and I like that very much.
But it's kind of ironical that the only way that we have to conceptualize this thing, ontology, is by projecting our own way of understanding the world into things. So in a way, it's
Yeah, but I hope that's not what we're doing, though.
Yeah.
I hope, because I think that would be the wrong turn. It would bring us. It would just be sneaking, the sovereign subject back into the conversation.
That's right. I mean,
One of the things I notice is that I easily explain so many things. It's almost like a good theory can be applied to so many different phenomena. Do you see it having limitations or places where you bump up against its what breaks down? You might even think about using something else.
Well, that's really what this panel is supposed to do.
We haven't done that.
You've been too nice. Well, I return to the book and find its limits. I would love to know that. That becomes the second edition. I just don't see those because I'm enchanted by the project. I haven't fully understood a lot of things yet, and there's a lot on. I find. Can anyone in the room honestly say they understand 1,000 Plateaus? I mean, have you read that book? I mean, there's so much literature out there on. I just don't get all that stuff. So I feel. I just feel my limits often. my own intellectual limits. There's just so much to engage. There's so much I haven't done. Every time I read something, I think, damn, I should have put that in the book. You know, it's just this, I'm constantly meeting the limits. And they're my limits. Just simply, I didn't know that. There's stuff out there that's very hard to understand. I've tried to understand Deleuze and Guthrie. There's a lot of it I just don't get. I'm not, you know, and the new materialism, there's a little too much excitement there. It makes me suspicious.
You don't want to do that in China. That's right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.